see I'm not the only one from Bristol here today then. That's good.
Right. I might gonna give a short introduction to the session. So, hello and welcome. This is our third event of the Responsible AI series organized by Climate Action Tech and sponsored by ustwo. And this is our first session hosted online. And today we are delighted to be joined by Chris Preist. Chris is Professor of Sustainability and Computer Science and Director of Sustainability at the University of Bristol. He'll be sharing his work on understanding the environmental impact of AI from the footprint of individual interaction to the wider global system that drive energy use and emissions. So before I hand over to Chris, I love to invite Sarah, who is Climate Action Tech's director, to say a few words about CAT. For those who may not know, Climate Action Tech is a community of over 11,000 people on some channel on Slack. Am I right, Sandra?
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of you might be from CAT, but a lot of you might also not. So, Climate Action Tech is an online community primarily gathering on Slack, but we do also run event series like these. And the whole point of it is to equip tech workers with the skills that they need to take climate action. And the beauty of it all is that it is very much across organizational boundaries. So people from various companies, various industries even, get together to talk about how we can make the tech industry greener. And yeah, online events and in-person meetups help connect us across the globe, and this one is one of them. So very excited to have this one today.
Amazing. Thank you, Sandra. Incredible work at Climate Action Tech. If you're not on the channel in the Slack, already join it because it's full of great channels. So, right. So we are ready. Whenever you're ready, Chris, you can take over the screen and
Great.
the stage
Thank
is
you.
all yours.
Yeah, thanks very much. Okay, so thanks very much for inviting me, Paolo. I'm really pleased to be presenting what I've got to offer here. I'll just say what I'm going to do. I've got a presentation. I'm really happy to stay on afterwards beyond the hour for anyone that wants to, for any additional questions. There will be time at the end for questions, but I've got quite a lot to cover. I'll just say that, and sometimes it can kind of take some time. If you've got any questions that you want to pop into the chat, I won't be able to see them, but if they're clarificatory questions, then Paolo will just pop in and ask them, and I will make sure I clarify what I mean if there's something that's not clear. That's the plan. Okay, so let me just share my screen. There we go. Right, that should be all right for you guys. Yeah, okay, good. So what I want to do is speak about the environmental impacts of AI, but I'm really interested in helping you think through the dynamics of those impacts rather than necessarily a snapshot at any given time. What's driving them? How might they change in the future? And this is based on some work I've done at Bristol. Which I can share with you. So first of all, looking at the big picture, and I know that you guys will be more familiar than many of my audiences with some of this stuff, but I will briefly go through it again as a reminder for you. This is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change last AR report, Working Group 3, which is the part that looks at how technologies interact with climate change mitigation, etc. And this is the only sentence about digital technology in it, and it basically says that digital tech can be both positive and negative with regard to emissions and emissions reduction through three factors. The first is their own carbon footprint, in other words, the direct impacts of digital technology, the energy use by them, and the environmental impact of manufacturing them. Secondly, the applications of those technologies for mitigation and in other ways. And thirdly, the fact that digital tech changes the way we organize societies. It induces social change. And all of those things will have an impact on the climate, effectively. And so we need to understand those things. And as I said, in the IPCC, the previous report, there was very limited understanding of these. And using the language, you guys might be familiar with some of this language, which is used in the literature, the ICT4S literature, for example. We distinguish between the direct impact, which is the impact of the manufacturing and use of digital tech, the enabling impact, which is the impact of the use of that digital tech and how that digital tech changes the way people do things effectively. And then finally, the systemic impact, which is how digital tech changes the way we organize society over time. And what I want to do is say that this, except for some brief comments at the end, this presentation is completely focused on the direct impact of AI and data centers. What I'm trying to do is look and unpeel what we know about how AI is impacting climate change with regard to the data center rollout. And I'm going to be I won't be exclusively focused on energy, but I'll be mainly focused on energy. There are other factors as well, and I won't have time to go in with regard to kind of raw material uses, etc. I won't have time to go into them, but if we have time in the questions, I'm happy to take questions around those as well. Okay, so the big picture. So roughly, ballpark figure, if we look at the direct emissions of digital tech, including the manufacturing, etc., and aviation, then roughly they're the same, depending on when you put the boundaries. If you put the boundaries the same for the two sectors, then they come out as roughly the same. If anything, digital tech is slightly smaller than aviation. But if you start to include things like entertainment, television sets, etc., then digital tech can start going over. So these two things are roughly the same size in terms of the global problem that we face. But if we look at the kind of distribution, then we have a different picture. And the next slide shows the distribution of these things. So if we look at distribution, aviation is very much a technology of the elite. Basically, only 1% of the global population flies more than one round trip a year. And those are responsible for a large number of the extra trips. And then broadly, only about maybe about 10% of the global population fly at all in a year. Whereas if you look at digital technology, it's spread far more globally across the population. 2/3 of us access the internet. And so many people have smartphones. More than 1 in 2 people around the world have smartphones, or at least feature phones, which allow internet connectivity. The infrastructure, even though obviously there's more infrastructure in global north countries, global south countries also have extensive infrastructure. Places like Kenya, Somalia, etc., have extensive mobile coverage. And so as a result, if you're looking at the footprint of an individual, you'll find that the footprint of an individual's digital emissions footprint is relatively small, even in the global north. But if we add up all 6 billion of us who use digital tech, then overall it comes to the same size as aviation. And so digital tech is a more environmentally egalitarian technology, in that the footprint is more spread through the global population than aviation. And this means we need different approaches to think about how to deal with it. A kind of approach that's aimed purely around behavior change is unlikely to have so much of an effect, because the issue is spread so broadly across the global population. Whereas you could imagine aviation, if you if you had a sufficiency approach to aviation, then you could imagine that having a really significant benefit. With regard to digital tech, it's far harder to do that because it's so spread around the world. Okay, and so that's the kind of big picture, and that's what I wanted to say about that diagram. That's for 2020. That's the last time we have a kind of global snapshot of this. So, and so this is the picture before AI. AI changes this picture, but not a lot. It kind of results, I don't think you can see my pointer on this, but it kind of results in the kind of first 1 to 2 billion people, or rather the highest 1 to 2 billion, being pushed up a bit on this image is what we see. So AI. So this is the classic headline. I forgot where I found this one, but AI centers, data centers are coming for your land, water, and power. And what I want to do is kind of dig into this question and think about what's going on here, both from a kind of individual point of view and a more global point of view. So first of all, why is this such a big issue? So some of you might recognize this. This is an NVIDIA Grace Hopper GPU. And this is what we have. As you may know, some of you may know that Bristol hosts Isambard AI. Isambard AI is the national research supercomputer for basically for the research facilities across the UK, hosted in Bristol. And Isambard AI contains it contains 5,448 of these grace hoppers. A grace hopper isn't a big thing. It's about the size of one to two hand palms, so it's not a huge thing. But if you look at the amount of electrical power it draws between 450 and 1,000 watts of power over time, fluctuating 450 when it's idling, creeping up to 1,000 when it's in its kind of maximum state. And so that's the kind of power draw it has. And if you look at that over time, if you look at an average power draw of a UK household, the average power draw of a UK household is about 600 watts. So that means one of these grace hoppers has a power draw of electricity roughly equivalent to a UK household. Now, there are differences. The main difference is that a household, the power is far more fluctuating. At times it's near zero, at other times it's going to be 3 kilowatts, 4 kilowatts, when the oven's on, when the kettle's on, etc. So it's far more spiky. Whereas a grace hopper is far more steady. It fluctuates between 450 and 1,000 watts over the day. So there are differences, but broadly, a grace hopper and a household draw the same amount of power over time. And so when you think about that, that means this grace hopper is a serious beast when it comes to power, which means that explains why so much electrical power is needed to power these new AI data centers. Isambard AI, we have a new 5 megawatt grid connection to the site, which was put in place to allow the development of Isambard AI. Isambard AI is a very small computer compared with the standards of the hyperscalers, which are creeping up to kind of 200 megawatts as far as a gigawatt in terms of power draw for the most significant of those. So electrical power is a very big issue for AI data centers. However, what I would say is that water is far less of an issue. So we have the data for water usage in Isambard AI, and one of these draws less than a single toilet flush per day in terms of water required to cool it. On cold days, it draws nothing. On slightly hotter days, it needs a little bit more, but it draws less than a toilet flush. And so electricity is exceptional, power is normal. Water is a kind of normal development thing. It means a huge data center will be drawing the power equivalent of a very large city, and it will be drawing the water equivalent of a small housing estate. Now, building a new small housing estate from a water point of view is not trivial. And if you're building in an area where there's water scarcity, then a small housing estate does contribute to a water problem. But it's a normal sized issue. It's more like golf courses, etc. Whereas electrical power is exceptional with regard to databases. So you've probably seen a lot in the press about water use. And I wanted to just say a little bit about why it kind of when you see that it kind of appears that both electricity and water are the same size problems, whereas I would argue that they're not. Water is the normal size problem. Electricity is exceptional with regard to data centers. So I want to say just a few words about why this is. So what you see here, this is I don't know if it's exactly the style that's used at Isambard AI, but this is what's called adiabatic cooling. And Isambard AI does use adiabatic cooling. I'm not sure it's this particular model. And adiabatic cooling, it's a kind of up-to-date way of using water compared with the traditional open-loop evaporative cooling, the open-loop approaches. Adiabatic cooling it's mainly air-cooled, and then you spray water on the air coils to allow the evaporation of that water in the same way that sweat works to carry the heat away. And so it's far more efficient at water use. It's more like us sweating than us getting into a cold bath to cool down, if you see what I mean. That's how it does. So it's far more efficient. And so this is kind of newer technology. And what happens when you look at the water use data that is made public, or rather that is put out by the press and by some academic papers, you see two things that are happening that means that they don't estimate AI water use accurately, why they overestimate AI water use. First of all, they use either old data or average data for water use by data centers per kilowatt, per kilowatt hour. And so that kind of conflates this new technology for cooling with the older techniques. And what I would say is newer data centers, AI data centers have got to use this new technology. They can't use the older techniques because they just don't work with the quantity of, or rather the density of heat that AI generates. So it can't use the older technologies. So the first is they overestimate because they assume that a kind of average technology is used rather than the new technologies which are essential for AI data centers. And the second and far more significant thing is that they kind of conflate water use by the data center itself with water use by the people who generate the electricity for the data center. So they include so that's the same. And in the US, it's different from the UK. In the US, some areas of the US which either use coal or hydroelectric power use far more water to generate their electricity. And so they use this electricity, and so this is the indirect water use of the data center. And so that can look like quite a significant figure, but it's not drawn in the region of the data center, so it doesn't contribute to the data center's water draw in that area. And also, I think an important point to make is that water use is used everywhere in America. It's any electricity in America, whether it's from microwaves or television sets or steel manufacturing, is using that same water because they're all using that electricity. And renewable energy, if you move to renewable energy, then it both obviously reduces carbon emissions and it also reduces that water use connected with electricity generation. So renewable energy is always a good thing to do. And for Isambard AI, we are moving towards, over time, we're moving towards wind generation plus battery technology to power it. That's not up in place yet, but that's local wind generation plus battery is the ambition that we have for Isambard AI. So that's why, but I'm happy to talk about that more later on if we choose towards the end. So what I want to do now, I've just spoken about I'm going to focus mainly on electricity and the carbon emissions associated with electricity. And there's often, there's kind of people talking about how to do greener querying with AI, and talking about basically what's the carbon footprint of an AI chatbot, which should we use them less, etc. And so what I want to do first of all is look at what's the environmental impacts of using a chatbot. And we're going to consider one typical, in inverted commas, chatbot interaction. And we're only considering the data center and its activity. We're not considering network use or the person's end device, whether it's the smartphone or a laptop, etc. And one important point I want to make, and this is true of almost all life cycle assessment work, we're going to be using what I call a scoping assessment. We're not going to claim undue accuracy. We're trying to get ballpark figures rather than to say we have an exact figure. And often carbon footprints are presented as being very exact, when in truth they're far more uncertain than they appear to portray themselves as. So I'm going to be honest about that and say I'm going to work with ballpark figures to give you just some sense of where the hotspots are in the system. Right. Okay, so looking at, because it's a life cycle assessment, we want to think about the whole of the system. And what we're going to do is look at the manufacturing of the data center and the GPUs, the training of the AI, and then the usage of the AI in the form of a chatbot thing. And I'm actually going to present it the other way around. I'm going to first of all talk about the usage and then move on to the others. And the point I want to make, first of all, is that the manufacturing and training are like sunk costs, in that you kind of produce your product in the same way that you set up a factory and design your product if you're building cars. And then then there's also a per unit cost, which is the direct usage of the system to satisfy the chatbot query, if you see what I mean. And often it's quite right that we want to look at the whole life cycle, but it's important to distinguish between the in-use costs and the sunk costs when one is thinking about any behavioral change intervention. Again, that's something I'm happy to speak about later on in the questions. Okay, so in terms of the in-use costs, we have a kind of a fairly good summary of, based on kind of 2025 figures, we have a fairly good summary of various different data points that have been around, looking at what happens when we are looking at particular, so we kind of experiments on kind of the AI energy score, which uses it uses an experimental setup to test things, and we also have some data from real world systems. In particular, Google has been reasonably transparent about its emissions associated with energy use during inference. And so as a result of that, we have some figures for a typical query, what we call a kind of median query, which means it will be a kind of small to medium length chatbot query, not one with complex reasoning. And I'll say words about that in a moment, but a kind of medium length chatbot query. And it comes out around between 0.3 and 3 watts, tending towards, when you're kind of having in the real world systems, it's tending towards the lower end of those, with the experimental systems where they can't kind of do they can't do as much of the kind of multitasking there. It comes out at higher figure, and also older technologies come out as higher figure. So for 2025, we can use a rough figure of 0.5 watt hours for a single query as an example. Okay, so we're going to use that in our system as a rough for a kind of basic query in the AI system. But we don't only want that, we also want to look at training. And if we look at training, so Epoch AI has done good work pulling together data on training. And Grok, so the last data it has is from Grok. It seems that the AI companies have become less transparent since then, so it's hard to make these estimates. But for Grok 4, the last data it has, they estimated 310 gigawatt hours of GPU use doing training. And as you may know, Grok has allegedly, in some parts illegally, gas-fired turbines on its site. And the emissions from those gas-fired turbines will be about 154,000 tons of CO2e. That's roughly the same amount of emissions as all the flights coming in and out of Heathrow over 3 days, to give you some sense. So it's quite a significant scale. Obviously, it's amortized over all the users. So that's the training. And then the embodied, we've got a couple of good data sources. One is NVIDIA's own reports for an H100. And the other is a strip down of an A100 GPU. And we find that, again, these two things come out as roughly the same ballpark magnitude for a GPU. And so it comes out, the NVIDIA's is higher than the academic one, but it does include the chassis and the memory, whereas the academic one did not include that. And so I'm going to use the NVIDIA's one, and it's about 160 kilograms CO2e for a GPU. So that's the manufacturing and disposal of the GPU. And they found that, so I'm excluding, in these LCAs, they also include the use of that GPU. I'm deliberately excluding that at this point because the use is exactly in the chatbot query, which we already have data for. Okay, so what we now need to do is allocate the embodied and the training impacts to the use time. So what we're going to do is take a share of the manufacturing of the GPUs and a share of the training, and we're going to allocate it to each query that we make. And so if we look at the training, then what we'll do, we'll make some assumptions here. We're going to assume that the model is used for about a year, and we're going to allocate it a share of the training cost of that model to each query. Partly that's because we got the data. So if we take ChatGPT and assume that the training was about the same as Grok, then it was 18 billion per week in July 2025. Grok has about a 10% share of that. And so allocating the energy costs of training to the query, we find that we get about between 0.3 for ChatGPT and 3 watt hours for Grok. So basically a lighter used model, the training costs get amortized over less queries. So it's more expensive. The training per query is more expensive. And so 0.3 to 3 watt hours per query. So then we move on to the embodied emissions. We can assume the GPU lifetime of 3 years. So that might be optimistic. There might be signs that that's being optimistic. So certainly traditionally, for traditional data centers, that would be pessimistic. You'd expect about kind of 5 to 6 years lifetime out of a high performance data center. But GPUs might be being optimistic there. But let's say 3 years. And we'll assume a 50% load. So we're going to assume rather than 400, as I said, it will range between 400 and 1,000. We're going to assume 500 watts draw roughly. That's probably being pessimistic, deliberately being pessimistic here. So we're going to be over allocating to be on the safe side, because I would expect that the data center will be higher. The utilization will be higher than that. So then based on that, what we'll do is we'll allocate the emissions during manufacturing and disposal of the GPU to the energy used by the GPU. And what we do is per watt hour of energy used by the GPU, we allocate 0.02 grams of emissions to account for its embodied emissions. What we'll do is, because that's only for the GPU and the memory, what we're going to do is we're going to double that to take into account, just estimate, take into account the basically the interconnect, the manufacturing of the data center, etc. And we do know that the GPUs dominate in this. So doubling is a reasonable estimate for a ballpark estimate of what's going on here. So putting that all together, then what we find is for a chatbot, it's going to be, for a query, it's going to be 0.5 watt hours for the inference, up to about 5 watt hours if the reasoning is more complex. We want to add the training, so 0.3 watt hours for the training, up to about 3 watt hours for less used models training. And then finally, we're going to add 0.04 grams of CO2e per watt hour of usage for the embodied impacts. And altogether, if we take the UK mix for electricity, it's between 0.14 to 1 gram of CO2e per chatbot interaction. The higher score being for more complex queries to less used models. In other words, the higher score will be asking Grok to do a reasoning-based query. And the US mix, whereas the lowest one will be simpler queries to higher used models, like asking ChatGPT to do a non-reasoning based query. And similarly for the US mix, 0.35 to 3 grams. So that gives you some kind of ballpark figure for this. So that's the kind of order of magnitude estimate for a chatbot query that we can have for this. So what I want to do is, because it's really interesting to think about as we integrate chatbots into our lives, into our how it compares with other digital practices. And one digital practice, this is a bit of a bugbear of mine, is extra screens. So many people have multiple screens. Some people have good reasons for those multiple screens. Other people have those multiple screens partly just because they're a bit of a status symbol. And at Bristol University, we used to have a double screen setup as default in many places. And basically, if you look at the carbon footprint of an extra screen, the University of Bristol one, which admittedly is a high spec one, it's 600 kilograms. And so 600 kilograms is roughly equivalent to over 1 million chatbot requests at 2025 efficiency levels. Going back to my figures, varying between 200K reasoning to low use models up to 4,200K simple queries to high use models. So in other words, so if we look at these two practices, it's very likely that having an extra screen attached to your workstation is a higher impact practice than regularly using chatbots. We haven't got onto agentic stuff, of course, but regularly using chatbots as part of your daily practice of your work as a digital practice is probably less impactful than having an extra screen. And what I say about this is that this is something that we identified. I did some work with a master's student of mine who ended up being an MP, sitting on the climate change committee. And her work identified for the university as screens being a particular hotspot in terms of our digital emissions. And as a result of that, we managed to basically get the university to put in place no longer having 2 screens as default, and also prioritizing reuse of existing screens, particularly if people wanted an extra screen. Nowadays, you don't go and you're not issued with a new screen every time. It's that we will see if there's some, if the IT services have spare ones. If you want an extra one, they will find one for you. So that will significantly reduce our emissions, our embodied emissions from our digital work by questioning that digital practice, which is, if you like, profligacy rather than sufficiency, having multiple screens.
Chris, sorry, I just gonna ask you something that is in the chat. Someone was asking, over how long is the 600 kilograms? Like when you're comparing...
Over the lifetime of the screen. And okay. I think they assume of a lifetime about 4 years. Yeah. So it'll be over the lifetime of the screen. So it's about 150 kilograms a year.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So given that, so this is an interesting thing that when I was looking this through, so if you look at just chatbot queries, you find that it cannot explain, even when you take into account reasoning-based things, etc., it cannot explain why so much investment is being put into data centers. And so there's a new 1 gigawatt data center in North Lincolnshire. That data center alone, when it's built, would be able to offer every person in the world, all 8 billion of us, a prompt every 4 hours using 2025 technology. So why is so much data center being built? It's obviously not just chatbots. And so that's one of the kind of questions that I was interested in. And the other thing to say, so if you look at Anthropic, so until relatively recently, until about 6 months ago, Anthropic only had access to 1 gigawatt of compute. In other words, Anthropic's access to compute power was only equivalent to this single data center being built there. And if you look at what Anthropic has done as a business with only access to 1 gigawatt compute, you can see that quite a lot has been done with only 1 gigawatt compute. So what's going on? Why are so many data centers being built? Why, what's going on here? That's really the question that I was asking when I did this kind of analysis. Before I kind of get into the bigger data center question, what I want to do is acknowledge that the 2025 snapshot is only a snapshot. And there's two things going on. The first is that there are efficiency improvements going on. So the hardware is getting more efficient. Blackwell, in my view, optimistically, is claiming a 20 to 30 times improvement on the H100 in terms of efficiency. And there's also efficiency improvements based on the modeling software techniques, model quantization, knowledge distillation, mixture of experts architecture, etc. And Google reported that they got a 33 times efficiency improvement in a year. And there are even more radical approaches going on. Extreme quantization, what they call less than 1 bit quantization, which is pruning out sparse parts of the neural network. Multiplication-free models, so you get rid of the n squared approach, the matrix multiplication, and replace it with linear efficiency. Neurosymbolic AI, and this is an area of particular kind of interest to me, because I was originally a symbolic AI guy back in the 80s and the 90s. I cut my teeth in Hewlett-Packard's AI research lab back in AI and back in the 80s and 90s, and it was all symbolic AI back then. I did a lot of work on logic-based systems, integrating statistical techniques into logic-based systems back then. And neurosymbolic AI is kind of doing the opposite of what I was doing back then. It's taking a neural network and saying, let's use symbolic approaches to look at parts of this, because symbolic approaches are far more efficient for doing high-level processing than the neural networks are. And I was just saying, I don't know how many of you have played with the new Mythos. I forgot what they call it now, but it was released 2 days ago. I was actually playing it this morning, and it was producing remarkable pieces of work for me as I was going through. And then it said, here's a summary of the 6 documents that I've produced for you. But it had only produced 5 documents, so it can't count. It can do remarkable things, but it can't count. And neurosymbolic AI is kind of trying to get around that. It's both making it more efficient and trying to effectively allow it to do some of these things that it struggles with more easily. Conditional computation is a more sophisticated version of mixture of experts, making sure you only use as little sparse activation of the neural networks, little as you want. And then linear attention, trying to keep, rather than looking back at your entire history, trying to keep a kind of summary of what's going on at any given time. So again, that reduces the complexity of looking back at everything you've done in the past for the next piece you want to do. So all of these are really radical efficiency improvements. They can reduce the energy used for the same amount of if you like, value of chatbot service over time. But of course, that is not going to stop growth of AI. Everyone's familiar with, I'm sure you're familiar with Jevons paradox. It's not exactly Jevons paradox that's going on here. There's a number of things going on, but it tends to all be lumped together as Jevons paradox. Again, that's something I'm happy to pick up in the questions if you like. But what I would say is that it's clear, if you like, compute availability is a bottleneck at the moment, and any improvement in efficiency that the major providers will make will result in more usage rather than less electricity being used. And here's the things that, first of all, more users. So the use of AI is cheap. It's cheap once you develop your model. It's cheap to provide it to the users, exactly because it's so energy efficient. So it can be provided free as a freemium product, which means that already more than 1 billion of people in the world are using this kind of technology on a weekly basis. And also this is enabled by the fact that technology diffusion is faster than ever before. The internet provides a platform, which means that not only do people in London and New York and Malmo have access to this, but people in rural Somaliland also have access to this technology if they have a smartphone. So as a result, technology diffusion is faster than ever, which means more and more experimentation is being done. There's also increased use per user. Agentic AI, the possibility of basically spawning jobs to do stuff in the background, more complex jobs, and also embedded AI, simpler AI, but embedded in our routine activities, such as Google search, which are now any Google search is a small AI query rather than simply a search as it used to be. And of course, increased reasoning. Video in particular is something that can use energy significantly more than either image generation or text generation. Inference time deliberative reasoning, that uses some, and then agentic reasoning. All of these things can drive up usage. And really, so there's this kind of battle between these two things that are going on. The efficiency improvements, and there will be a lot of investment in efficiency improvements because software efficiency improvements pay off very, very significantly given the cost of data center hardware, data center hosting, etc. Versus these drivers of increased usage. And certainly in the short term, the drivers of increased usage are definitely going to win. So emissions will be going up from this. So this is from the IEA, the recent IEA report. This is a Hannah Ritchie diagram based on the IEA report. And this just gives you some sense of how more complex reasoning results in more emissions. I said earlier on, reasoning, I estimated a ballpark figure of reasoning being about 5 watt-hours. The IEA then came up with this, and it actually agrees roughly with mine, 7.6 watt-hours, so order of magnitude correct. And then adding that into agentic, you get up to 50 watt-hours. So sophisticated agentic reasoning base can be significant. So these are all things that can drive up energy use over time. So what I want to do now is move away from what's go on to the question of what this means for data center energy. And the point I want to make, so IEA produced some more further, so this is 2025 graphs, they produced some this year, which broadly say it's roughly the same. There are some small changes, but I haven't managed to update my slides with the newer version yet, but broadly the message is the same qualitatively, what's going on. So the point that I want to make, and you guys will be familiar with this, is that data centers are not just accelerated GPUs. Accelerated GPUs are not just AI, and AI is not just the big name AI like ChatGPT and Anthropic and Grok. Okay, that's the point I want to make, and that's kind of the story behind this that's going on. So the first thing, as I said, data centers are not just accelerated AI. And if we look at what's going on around the world, so there is, at the same time as the AI rollout, further global digitization, a trend that's already in place, which is as countries in the global south become wealthier, then there is increased expectation of digital services in these countries, both in government, in the private sector, and for personal entertainment and communication, etc. And so it's easier to put in a mobile phone connection to a village in rural Somaliland than it is to put in place a road. And so these technologies are rolling out far more faster than other technologies. Global digitization continues. There'll be more data centers built to serve the needs of this expanding expectations, particularly in Asia and the global south. So historically, until AI came along, we in the West were kind of roughly, the amount of kind of data center energy use was roughly stable in that our increased usage was offset by efficiency gains. But now it's rolling out more quickly in the global south. That is changing things slightly as we go on. So global digitization, and these are CPU based, not GPU based. And then the next trend is the GPUs computers. And as I said, it's not only AI. First of all, there is what was already happening before: video, data, video compression, video, that kind of thing, data science, animation, classificatory AI. In other words, the kind of work that people have been doing for about 10 years, which uses GPUs. And so this will carry on. This is something that was already happening. And in fact, I looked at figures for 2024. And in 2024, GPU sales, the estimate from a trade body was that half of the GPU sales will still be using for these traditional data science classificatory AI purposes. Only half were being used for Gen AI. That will be different now, but that was kind of at that time, only half of the sales of GPUs were Gen AI. So this trend, the data science classificatory AI, particularly again, as that takes off in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, that will also result in more GPUs being deployed. And then, of course, the generative AI, which is what we're talking about here. And as I said, generative AI is not only the big players. The general purpose generative AI, ChatGPT, etc., is only one part of it. The other part of it, which I suspect many of you will be more familiar with than many of the people I speak with, is well, I'll come back to in a moment, but it's different stories. So first of all, looking at the general purpose generative AI, ChatGPT, the story they tell, what sociologists would call a socio-technical imaginary, which drives investment into data centers, is the idea of the general superintelligence, generating bigger and bigger hyperscale frontier models and building large data centers to allow them to do it. These are closed general purpose models like ChatGPT, like Anthropic, and what you do is you put your data on top of them. So they are general purpose models which are aiming to be able to do anything that they want. They are large, they're very large models, so they require immense amounts of energy to train, but they run very efficiently because they can be run in large data centers in the same way that the hyperscalers scale up things. They can run very, very efficiently. And the power is in the capability of the models. And the story they tell is that they will become more and more capable over time, reaching a tech singularity with kind of ultimate superintelligence, which will lead to untold wealth and power and a dream of a glorious future for humanity, or doom, depending on who you listen to. And in some people's cases, they'll say, we don't know, either of these might happen. So that's the kind of driving story for this. But that's not only the driving story for AI. The other story is the AI is merely very useful story. And this is smaller, open source, open weight foundation models with more specialist training and lots of experimentation. And this is basically specialist expertise so it's not only in the model. The model is a foundation model, which you then add your own specialist expertise and data, and you integrate it into the system that you're using. And so as a result of this, GPU control is more distributed. It might be in a hosting data center. It might be in a company. It might even be in a server in someone's home. And that also means it's less efficiently used. You lose the efficiency benefits of hyperscaling. So it's more distributed, less efficiently used. And also, it can become smaller. It can move to the edge, which I'll talk about in a moment. So you can imagine the efficiency gains that we were talking about earlier, allowing this compute to move out of the data centers into laptops, into embedded devices, etc., etc., using distilled models. And to a certain extent, this is the story that China, I've got two logos here, of course, DeepSeek, and then Hugging Face, which is one of the kind of organizations which promotes the use of these open source models. And to a certain extent, China is more focused on the AI as merely very useful than the kind of, and so the socio-technical imaginary here is not, we're going to produce a super intelligent AI, but we're going to produce useful AI, which we embed around society in many, many, many different ways. And that might also explain why, if you look at the kind of attitudes to AI, there's a lot more anxiety in America than there is in China, though that is changing. Chinese people are becoming to be a bit more anxious around AI than they used to be. Okay, so AI is merely very useful. So can it move to the edge? And so here is, this was announced, well, I think it might be last week, or maybe the week before last. Some of you might know what this is. This is the NVIDIA RTX Spark chip. And this is something that will sit on laptops, effectively, high-end laptops. And And it's quite remarkable. So on this thing, so on a high-end laptop, you can have, sitting on this, a model which has performance similar to GPT's o4 mini model of early 2025. So in other words, on your laptop, you can have a general purpose AI which is of similar power to state of the art from a year and a half to 2 years ago. And if you remember, that it was pretty good back then. So you can have this on your laptop. It's going to be a high-end product. These laptops will cost about 300 quid or 3,000 quid or so. I don't know exactly. They haven't been announced. But it means substantial amounts of work can be done on a laptop rather than in a data center. And so there's going to be this tussle between these things. So will it result? So a lot of this work is going to move to the laptops, which means maybe less investment in data centers. It might mean stranded assets in data centers. It doesn't necessarily mean the environmental impact problem goes away, because this thing is going to be drawing, kind of order of 100 watts. And if you've got an agentic AI solution which is sitting in your bedroom chundering away constantly, it's going to be significant. And so rather than the environmental impact being all in the data centers, it's going to move out to the edge where it's less easy to understand, less easy to control. And so we will have a problem. And also the embodied emissions with this, it will result, so in terms of the overall emissions, the embodied emissions of this will be significant, and it might result in churn in updates of equipment, at least in the initial phases as the technology gets rolled out. So it might, this moves away from data centers where all the action is in terms of kind of environmental thinking. It's going to be worse at the edge. It's going to be worse in the laptops. We need to think about that as well. And that really is a question for me. If we look at the gold rush, what's going on, the AI gold rush, there's massive investment in data centers. And most of it is not big tech. This is work that was done by Bloomberg looking at this. You'll see that if we look at big tech by 2032, is not the main player. There's, first of all, the rest, which are the kind of co-location databases, which have been, data centers, which have been around for a long time. They're going to continue to invest. Finance, of course, is continuing to invest, but interestingly enough, these new players, which are speculative investments in data centers, are really substantial in terms of what's in the pipeline. These are people who have, the article, the Bloomberg article, kind of lists people who have made their money in all kinds of other different ways, who think, hey, why not open a data center? It's going to be the next big thing. And they don't exactly know how to manage data centers. Already one of them, since this Bloomberg article was published, has failed because they couldn't find customers. And so that particular project didn't go forward. So what's happening is there's a lot of investment in data centers that is purely speculative. This is what's driving the environmental impacts, not people actually using the technology. It's the imaginaries, it's the future imaginaries of what might be happening that's driving the environmental impact, driven by investment in this kind of stuff. And what I would say is, I think that the imaginaries might be wrong. I think that maybe we won't need as much data centers as these people think. They're betting, in my view, probably rightly, that AI will become very, very prevalent around society. But they're also betting, in my view, wrongly, that AI, that basically most AI inference will remain in the data centers. And I think that's betting against the efficiency improvements that researchers are coming up with. It's also betting against, if you think about an organization like ChatGPT or Anthropic, they would rather the inference was on your machine, as long as they get the money from the service, because it's you're paying for the electricity, you're paying for the hardware. And so I think there's a speculative bubble. I could be wrong, but I think there's a speculative bubble going on, particularly these new players who don't know what they're doing and are just piling money in because it's the next big thing. Okay, so that is the key for what I wanted to say. I want to just finish up coming back to the systemic and enabling impact. You may well have heard the story about, digital tech and AI, it's got these impacts, these data centers, but of course we can use it to save the planet. And that's a story that's been around for ages. It was used by my employers, Hewlett Packard, back in 2010. The Jesse Smarter 2020 report, which was released around that time. And it is, of course, questionable. And the main question is because the uses of the technology is not only about reducing impact, it can also be used to augment high impact industries. And this example here is Canadian tar sands, the most impactful source of oil there is from a greenhouse gas emissions point of view. And this is enabled by digital technology. It couldn't happen without it. It wouldn't be economically viable without it. And so you can't kind of do this kind of business about saying, we got our bad, but look at all the good we can do. Because you can't quantify the good versus the bad. And that's because what is good and what is bad, so whether we go in the direction, which direction we go in, is determined really by the legislative framework we are in. It's not determined by the technology. It's determined by whether the legislative framework is driving decarbonisation, so basically, and this is effectively a combination of carbon taxation, carbon trading, and industrial strategy driving decarbonisation. If you have a framework which is facing in a decarbonised direction, AI will move you there more quickly. If you have a framework which is explicitly trying to promote fossil fuels, as Donald Trump is trying to do, then AI will support that. And so really it's a technology, and it will be, the way it is used will be determined, whether it's positive or negative from an environmental point of view, will be determined exactly by the legislative framework in which it's deployed. Right, so thank you very much. I've finished. So conclusions: each person's AI footprint is small, but over 1 billion of us use it already. Wide R&D experimentation increases the impacts. Many of these small experimentation with the foundational models, all relatively small, but lots of learning going on. Electrical power is exceptional, water is not. Hyperscale general intelligence or lighter specialist intelligence are the two imaginaries. They're competing. And if the second is more accurate, efficiency improvements may allow a lot of good enough AI at the edge and device. That won't get rid of the environmental impacts. It will just move it and change the way those impacts manifest. And data center speculation may result in large redundant infrastructure and resource waste. GPU rental market price crash. That is speculative. That's my if you like, educated guess, rather than my kind of, I can't definitively say that's going to happen, but that's my educated guess. So thank you very much. I'm really open to questions.